Hello, I'm Justin Stabley, State Director of the Utah Reagan Caucus. Um, Something we've been talking a lot about in these recent chats is what effective governance actually looks like. And here to further discuss this topic, I have Representative Celeste Maloy, who in many ways has kind of become a flashpoint for the debate in Congress about how best to apply conservative principles in governance. Welcome, Representative.
Thank you. I've never been called a flashpoint before. That's a first for me. I'm a
Right?
super freshman, but
Well, it has been interesting how I'm sure your campaign has gone a little bit differently than you expected at this point.
yeah, so I mean, I won in a special election in 2023. I got sworn in just after Thanksgiving, so I've been in almost 7 months. And I did expect this election to be kind of a sleepy primary in very red Utah, but it has turned out to be a lot more exciting than I expected. But when you're running for Congress, you kind of expect anything.
Right.
And I'm 6 days out from my primary, and on June 25th, the day of the primary, I will have run 5 races in 12 months. The
Oh my
special
goodness.
convention when I won was June 24th last year, and I had never run for anything. So now I've done 5 races in a year, and I feel like I've caught up with all my colleagues.
Oh my goodness. That is crazy. Tell us a little bit about what kind of happened to change how your race has gone. It sounds like it came down to how you voted on a certain bill compared to how other people wanted you to vote. Give us a little bit of insight into what's going on here.
I don't really know what's going on, and I'm not going to speculate. So here's what I do know. Here's what everybody knows. Two
Mhm.
days before our state convention, Senator Lee, our senior senator, jumped into my race on behalf of my opponent and has been campaigning for him. I don't know why he did it. I have a lot of people ask me, and a lot of people speculate.
Mhm.
But my mom always told me if you're guessing other people's motivations, you're probably going to get it wrong. So I'm trying really hard not to guess at his motivations. He hasn't called me and told me why he did it.
Mm.
He does talk a lot about a couple of my votes, but we were on good terms after both of those votes.
Yeah.
And I didn't expect him to jump into the race. So I'm not sure what caused him to make that decision.
Sounds like a wise choice.
Yeah.
Um,
But it has made this a strange race. We don't usually
yeah,
have this kind of drama in Utah races. Don't
right.
usually have one member of the delegation out campaigning against another member of the delegation. Um, and I get a lot of questions about that. The first question is always, why did he do it? I don't know. And then the second question is, what happens next? So before you even have to ask that, I'll give you the answer that I give everybody. What happens next is I think I'm going to win this primary.
Hmm.
That means that Senator Lee and I will still be colleagues and we'll
Hmm.
both still be representing Utah. So I'm going to do whatever's best for Utah. I have been very careful since I found out about his endorsement of my opponent not to burn this bridge any further than it's a
Right.
little charred right now, but I'm not burning it. And and I'm so thankful that the House delegation rolled out a united endorsement on my behalf. I think
Hmm.
that helps show that we're not really fractured and in disarray in Utah. And after the primary, I mean, Senator Lee and I have several bills that we've introduced together. We're going to keep working on those. He wants smaller government. I want smaller government. He wants more accountability out of government. I want more accountability out of government. So we'll have a conversation. We'll get back to a better place and we'll keep working on things that are best for Utah. Because the one thing I think we both know is that Utahns don't want to see a lot of drama in the
Hmm.
delegation. They want to see the Utah delegation working for Utah.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the things that has really made Utah politics stand apart is
Yeah.
we're a very conservative state, but we're also a very low drama state, and we haven't embraced this more histrionic brand that we've seen kind of overwhelm so many other state parties. Um,
Well, and we play so well together. I've joked for a while now that probably the only state that can compete with Utah in having two such high profile senators from the same party who are so different. Maybe Kentucky with Rand Paul and Mitch McConnell can
mm,
compete with us, but
mhm.
everybody knows who Mike Lee is, everybody knows who Mitt Romney is. And yet, in Utah, we work really well together.
Yeah.
And even on the House floor, there's only four of us in the House delegation, and we tend to talk to each other on the floor. We don't all vote the same way, but we talk to each other about our votes. And other members of the House notice that. They give us a hard time, like, oh, here's Utah. They always hang out together. Here's Utah. They all actually like each other. That's
Hmm.
really rare.
Yeah. And I also think that we have more of a can-do attitude and we try to actually do the job of governing.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what you've seen in the House of Representatives, because it seems like there's starting to be a little bit of a divide amongst Republicans. I wouldn't necessarily say an ideological divide, but a divide in how we engage in rhetoric and how we try to make it so that our principles are still at the table, even in a time of divided government. Tell us what you've seen with those things.
So I don't know that we're starting to have a difference in rhetoric in the Republican Party. I think we always have. So another question I get a lot is, why are Democrats better at voting together as a block than Republicans? And I think the answer to that is the difference between why somebody chooses to be a Democrat and why somebody chooses to be a Republican. Um, without painting everybody in both parties with too broad of a brush, but in general, I think the majority of Democrats tend to like more of a structure. They're more willing to have a hierarchy within the party, and people support that. And we are sort of a loosely held coalition of people who are not that. We want less government. We want more transparency and accountability. We want states to have more authority, but we don't necessarily all agree on how to get there. And we don't really do well with authority. Somebody pointed out to me that we haven't had a Republican Speaker of the House leave of their own free will in like 60 years. We
Oh my
always end up
goodness,
throwing
yeah.
them out. Democrats don't do that. Their
Hmm.
speakers serve for a long time. They leave when they're ready to leave, and everyone stands up and applauds them on the way out the door and writes, glowing op-eds about them. And we
Hmm.
tend to, behead ours. So I think it's just the nature of being a Republican to some extent. And so I have tried as a brand new Republican to just recognize that we don't all agree. We're not all going to get in line, so to speak, but we do agree on the end goals. We
Hmm.
want smaller, more accountable government. We want a balance of power. We want federalism. We want the structures of our Constitution to work and to be in place. And I keep reminding my colleagues that usually when we're disagreeing about tactics. We're disagreeing about the steps it takes to get there. And if we can stay focused on the end goal, if we can stay focused on the fact that as Republicans, we tend to be conservative and we want smaller government. So if one of my colleagues says this is the way to get smaller government and another colleague says this is the way to get smaller government, let's support both of them. Let's let the bill come to the floor for a vote. Let's see
Hmm.
which one can get a majority. And then, if your idea didn't get the vote, let's move on to the next idea. What we haven't been good at lately, I am answering your question. I'm just doing it in a
Hmm.
really
Oh yeah,
roundabout way.
you're fine.
What we haven't been so good at lately is letting the body vote and then accepting the outcome.
Mm.
So things come to a vote, and then we have members of our body who want to keep re-litigating the same question over and over and over. They put forth an idea, it didn't get enough votes, so they want to take down the rule on something else and force everyone to go back and vote again.
Mm.
Um, and a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still, and it seems to be working in both directions right now. So somebody whose idea didn't get enough votes is still mad. Somebody who's forced to vote on it again because someone didn't like their vote is still mad. And we need to get past sort of the short game, the this week's
Mm.
events, and look long term. What do we want this country to be 50 years from now? What do we want this country to be 100 years from now? And honestly, even what do we want this country to look like a year from now would be a
Hmm.
better question than some of the ones we're asking.
Yeah, I've been quoting Benjamin Franklin so often lately in a lot of our chats, this idea that don't throw out half a loaf for lack of a whole loaf. And I'm sure you can observe that there's a lot of members of Congress on both sides, but it seems to be more obvious right now on the right side of the aisle that people are demanding absolute perfection in these bills. And
Yeah.
if they're not, they're turning more towards sabotage than they are trying to engage in the deliberative process. So, what could you tell us about what you feel like the art of governing is, instead of just being a pure obstructionist?
So I think the art of governing is being able to tell the difference between a win and a loss and being able to tell the difference between a friend and an enemy. So you've been quoting Benjamin Franklin a lot. I feel like I've been quoting my mom and my grandparents a lot. Turns
Mm,
out they kind of knew some stuff. Don't tell them I said
mhm,
that. Um, I don't want my mom to know she was right all along, but she was.
mhm,
And my grandpa would always say, what's the alternative? Think about the alternative before you make a decision. And I think we've kind of lost that. And I think that's how we could tell the difference between a win and a loss. So, for example, uh, we voted on 2 minibuses this year to fund the government halfway through the year. We were already way past the deadline. I think we were 3 CRs in by then. But I've taken a lot of heat for voting for 2 minibuses.
mm,
And I've also been running the whole time. So I've made a lot of calls, especially before the convention. I made a lot of like one-on-one calls to delegates. And I got asked about that a lot. And I would say, okay, when we're out of government funding, which is where we were, you've got 3 choices. You can do a continuing resolution. And I voted no on those. I don't think that's a good
mhm,
way to govern. You can vote for a spending bill, excuse me, or you can shut down. You can let the government go into a shutdown. The CR was a non-starter for me, and a shutdown is actually not good for the country.
mhm,
Um, but we never talk through, a lot of people, a lot of conservatives say, let's just shut it down. We're sick of the
mm,
government. Let's just shut it down. But this is where that consider the alternative comes in. So what happens if we shut down? Well, we stay shut down for a while, sometimes a day or two, sometimes a few weeks. We always reopen the government. We're not just going to disband the government and quit being a
mhm,
country. And then when we do reopen, we usually reopen, well, as far as I know, every single time we've reopened with an omnibus spending bill.
mhm,
So on one hand, I'm getting beat up for voting for a minibus by people who say just let it shut down, but that alternative leads to an omnibus. And we're not good right now in the Republican Party at honestly talking through the alternatives to figure out what's a win and what's a loss. And so I think the art of governing is that it's playing the long game and the short game at the same time. It's looking at a vote and saying, how does this fit into the big picture? And does this move us toward our ultimate goal? And if it doesn't, then what's the alternative? What else can we do? Instead, we tend to think in like 24-hour cycles because that's the way the news works right now. And a lot of my colleagues are feeling trapped because they're like, if I vote this way, I'm going to get lit up at home. If I vote this way, I think I'm going to get lit up next year for the,
mhm,
same vote. And so we've got to get out of the short term. We've got to be able to think longer term. If if this is a modest budget cut, but we can keep making modest budget cuts every year, should we do it? Maybe the answer is yes. If this is a budget increase and we've increased too many years, maybe the right answer is no. Maybe a shutdown in Omni is a better option, but we don't usually talk through the options. We just talk about, I chose this, it's the right way. Anyone who disagrees with me better look for a different job.
mm. Yeah, and I think most Republicans agree that Congress should be better at doing its job. We've
I think
we've
most
had a we
Americans agree.
yeah we've I mean we've essentially had government either by executive fiat or until the recent changes to the Supreme Court a lot of judicial activism, and this is where a lot of our actual rules and laws that we live by, day-to-day lives are actually coming from.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that a lot of the Republicans who would say, yes, I do support Congress doing their job, are nevertheless the ones who aren't engaging in the deliberative process because they want to
Yeah.
avoid the hard votes.
Yeah.
But that is part of the job of Congress, is to take those hard votes so that we don't have to be submitted to administrative state decisions or the Supreme Court
Yes.
coming in and having to interpret some vague language. Um,
Yeah.
tell
You're
us
you're
tell us what
speaking
you
my
think.
language right
I
now.
know, right? Yeah. So
This is
so
what
tell
I
us
get
more
nerdy
about.
about.
Yeah, this is the stuff I love. When you've interacted with these various congressmen who have this more obstructionist way of thinking, um, is that ever brought up that, like, hey, we're not doing our job, this is not helping the situation we're trying to do? What is their
It
response?
is. Responses vary, but I think that's a symptom of the same problem. Too many of the conversations are happening about that day's events and not the larger picture. So I try to
Mm,
talk to my colleagues all across the Republican spectrum about the larger picture because you're right. We're letting the executive branch do way too much of the governing in this country, and that's not the way it was supposed to work. The legislative branch has delegated way too much authority to agencies that are all part of the executive branch. And now the court is playing a bigger and bigger role in being the arbiter of that, where somebody sues an agency and the court decides whether it was right or not. And the legislative branch needs to step up and take back our authority that we've delegated and act as a check and a balance. We've let our role diminish and diminish, and we are, especially in the House, we're the most accountable, most responsive to the electorate. We have to stand for election every 2 years. So if we're making decisions that are harming Americans, we all lose our jobs. That's the way it's supposed to work. But we've delegated too much of that authority to the executive branch. And I was at an event last night talking about this. You know, if the city of Farmington, Utah is trying to get a wetland determination on a piece of property that they want to develop, and the Army Corps of Engineers is really slow at getting back to them, that isn't usually the main factor someone takes into consideration when they go vote for the president. There's
Mm.
so many layers between a staff officer at the Army Corps of Engineers or the IRS or the Bureau of Land Management, you name the agency.
Hmm.
They're so far removed from the president of the United States that the accountability is almost non-existent. Nobody's voting based on their decisions when they go vote at the ballot box. But I have to stand. You know, last night I was in Centerville. I was in Davis County standing in front of a group of people explaining my votes. And that's a much more direct accountability. And that's why we have to be better at reclaiming our authority and jealously guarding our authority against the other two branches like the founding fathers
Hmm.
intended. So when we're talking in those terms, when we're talking about that kind of change, Republicans all across the spectrum agree. You know, our majority makers in New York and our hardliners who tend to be thought of as obstructionists, they all agree on that principle. And then we go squabble about the steps it takes to get there. And
Hmm.
it's just short-sighted. We need to
Yeah.
stay focused on the end goal.
I think right now the Supreme Court is taking a lot of heat because in a lot of their decisions, they are trying to return power to Congress. They're trying to
I
return
agree.
power to the people. And
Yep.
I can almost see whenever I see the frustrated look upon the justices' faces that are just like, come on, Congress, tap
Do
us
your
out.
job.
Do your
Yeah.
job and stop getting, we're getting all the heat for making these decisions. You got to pick up the ball and run with it now.
You're absolutely right. I keep saying this on the campaign trail. The judicial branch is almost begging the legislative branch to do a better job of our jobs. The hot topic this summer is the Chevron case. Will Chevron get overturned? And
Hmm.
Chevron deference is, you know, the court's doctrine of how they defer to an agency's decision. When Congress isn't clear and an agency makes a decision, the court will defer to the agency as long as the thing the agency is doing isn't clearly in violation of what Congress said. And that's been, you know, a court doctrine since 1984. If they overturn that, I mean, that is a huge signal that
Hmm.
Congress has to step up and do a better job. And it really changes the dynamic in that balance of power. And I think it'd be a really good thing. So for those of us who are nerdy about separation of powers, legal nerds, nerdy about, you know, federalism and even government red tape and bureaucracy and how to fix that. This is an exciting ruling that everybody's sort of waiting to see what happens. And my prediction is that the court is going to tell the legislative branch again, please do your job. So I'm excited to be in the legislative branch right now, even
Hmm.
though it looks like a complete disaster and it looks like nobody in their right mind should want to be part of the legislative branch right now. I think we're having our little revolution moment. I think we're having a moment where we're waking up and realizing that we've got to change the way we've done things. And good governance is going to carry the day. When that happens, it's going to be the people who say, here's a path forward, that win, that they're going to be the leaders. They're going to be the ones who determine the future.
For sure, for sure. You know, and it requires that Congress once more becomes a deliberative body
Yep.
and necessarily a body involved in compromise. Now, that's considered a
Yep.
dirty word, a very, very
Yep.
dirty word, because there's a lot of confusion of the difference between compromising on principles, which we shouldn't do, and compromising
Right.
on legislation. Because
Yeah.
there's lots of different perspectives. You want lots of different perspectives at the table, and that's how this representative system works. Um, how have you gone about trying to do that, trying to make sure that you're not compromising on principle, but you are being a solutions oriented representative by trying to find workable compromise in legislation?
Well, first of all, I've introduced several bills that I think do that. So part of it is not just being reactive, introducing
Hmm.
bills that you think are a good way forward so that you're at the table, you're part of the conversation. But also, if you look at my voting record, I voted no on things that I think in principle are wrong, and I voted yes on things that I think in principle are going in the right direction, but didn't go as far as I would have liked them to
Hmm.
go. So I'll take that step. I'll put a new marker down, and then we'll keep working on getting the rest of what we want. And that's what you have to do. I get um, a little irritated sometimes with people who talk about how much they love the Constitution, but then also say they hate compromise. Because I think we
Hmm.
forget in a modern context that the Constitution was a big, big compromise. The
Oh yeah.
people who went into that convention in Philadelphia, nobody went in wanting the thing that came out. They all went in wanting different things, and they hammered it out, worked with each other, and went out and drank with each other at night and talked to each other and got cranky with each other until
Hmm.
they came up with a compromise that is absolutely beautiful. I mean, it has been the ultimate law of our country for 250 years, and no one of those people could have written something that was that effective on their own.
Right.
And so I think again, if you keep your eye on the end goal, then it helps you see where to compromise and where not to compromise, because compromise isn't necessarily synonymous with capitulation, but we treat it
Right.
like that now.
Right. To bring Benjamin Franklin into the conversation again, at the end of the Constitutional Convention, he essentially said, I'm not sure that I like this Constitution, but I'm also not sure that we can come up with anything better. So I'm going to support it for now. And then a lot of the founders kind of felt that way. And then going out and arguing and debating on behalf of the Constitution is kind of what finally converted them what they had created. And then,
Yeah,
of course, there's a story of the Bill of Rights, how there wasn't initially there, and the Anti-Federalists made a big stink, and then that got there.
yeah,
And so you're totally right. Like we talk about, I mean, in Utah, we love talking about how the Constitution is divinely inspired. Um,
yeah,
but you look at the true deliberative nature of how it came across. You had to have all these different perspectives come in, craft those
yeah.
compromises between legitimate, thoughts and everything, and we ended up with something that's amazing. Um,
And they were passionate. I mean, it wasn't that everybody went in and passively, sort of, okay, if that makes you happy, I'm just going to do it. They were very passionately debating for the things that they believed in,
mhm.
and that gave us a better outcome. If people are willing to get in and really defend their principles, but then accept the outcome, then we can keep moving forward.
Well, yeah, a lot of people don't know that Hamilton was so frustrated with where things were going in the Constitutional Convention, he actually left and did not return. But then later, when he saw what came out of it, he was the key author in the Federalist Papers that argued for the Constitution. And so it just shows you, like you said, people are very, very passionate. And
Yeah,
a lot of times compromise comes down to what what can be livable for both sides right now.
yeah,
And like you said, I love that you talk about that incrementalism, because I think in a lot of ways you've lost that part of conservatism that it goes all the way back to Edmund Burke, this idea that
yeah,
we don't want to completely overwhelm the status quo necessarily. We
right.
want to make small tweaks here and there. We want to move along the process. And especially when you have divided government, when you have the smallest possible majority ever,
Yeah.
incrementalism is going to have to be the name of the game if you want to accomplish anything.
Well, and that's textbook conservatism, right? Like
Hmm.
small c conservative means we respect the institutions and we make incremental changes and we learn from the wisdom of the past, and we're not radical. We don't swing drastically from one direction to another. I mean, that's what conservative means. And I think we've kind of lost track of that. What we call conservative now is actually fairly radical in some instances, even if not in principle, in practice. And so
Hmm.
when I say we need to keep our eye on the end goal, that part of what I mean by that is that we are conservative in our movement towards that goal, so that we don't have, an action has a opposite reaction. And so when we take really drastic moves, then there's a really drastic backlash usually. But when we can incrementally move towards things, then we can bring people along with us.
Yeah, one of my big pet peeves right now is that when you have various figures who are more radical, various news agencies will call them more conservative. And that just drives
Yeah,
me crazy, because conservatism and radicalism, when you really boil down to the history of these philosophies, are two different things, often against each other.
Yeah.
Conservatism tends to be very institutionalist. We tend to like the status quo, what Bert called prescription, like things are the way they are for a reason, and we shouldn't tear them down unless we have a really, really good reason.
Yeah.
Whereas
But we can
radicals
keep
have this
improving them.
exactly, we want to keep improving them. But then radicals have this like we want to tear it down, way of thinking, and that's not conservative.
Right.
Um, and it's just and part of this is just getting out there and discussing these ideas, right? I think too often we talk based on the terms that kind of is that the media puts out there and that different people want to put out there, and we don't kind of put a foot down and say, actually, let me tell you what conservatism is. You know, well,
Yeah.
looks like we are just about out of time.
I think we
Thank you
are.
so much, Representative Malloy, for being with us and talking about
You're
us.
welcome.
We're super happy to have endorsed you. I like to hope that we helped you get over that 40% level in convention to help you get to this
Thank
point in
you.
the primary runoff because oh my goodness, that was a little bit close, wasn't it?
It was much more of a nail biter than I would have liked for it to have been, but here we are, 6 days out from the primary. We survived that. We'll survive this. Thank you for the support. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Is there a final message you'd like to offer before we finish up?
I guess my message is just, I'm looking forward to serving a full term in the House. In the partial term I've had, I've learned a lot. And one of the biggest things I have learned is that there is a big appetite out there for a smaller, more accountable government. And I think that's something Ronald Reagan would approve. And we're going to need a big tent to get there. We're going to need a lot of
Yes.
different people with different ideas to create a big enough majority to be able to accomplish that goal. So thank you for being part of that majority. Thank you for your support. And I look forward to continuing to work towards these goals.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Representative.